and Christine McSherry.
If you need to use that.
Are we down to chair?
So we ask all public commenters to be mindful that we have 5 minutes each allotted to you. And we hope you can be concise and keep your comments within that range. We'll begin with Fleur Chandler, and if you could first state any conflicts of interest that you might have.
I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for many years. I'm currently in a contract role with Sanofi Genzyme. I have stock in GlaxoSmithKline. I am the chair of Project Hercules, which is partially joint funded by a pharma consortium and Duchenne UK, but I take no payment for my activities with that group. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to provide comments. My name is Fleur Chandler. I'm a health economist. I have over 25 years of experience in industry and also sat on a national HTA committee for 6 years. My other more important role is being mother to Dominic, who is 13 and has Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. My third role is as chair of Project Hercules, which is a global collaboration generating HTA evidence for Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy, not to be confused with the Little Hercules Foundation. Today I'm representing the Hercules economic team, and please note this includes 3 global expert academics, Professor Ron Akehurst, Professor Keith Abrams, and Professor Jalpa Doshi. I'm also trying to bridge the patient and health economics perspectives, because it's quite an unusual position to be in to have both of those. I am not here to comment on or defend companies' evidence trial packaging or pricing. I think we've noticed that lack of robust evidence will be a key theme today, and we recognised this in 2017 when the patient organisation Duchenne UK identified the need for payer evidence in Duchenne and set up Project Hercules. It's a global collaboration of experts from academia, HTA bodies, clinicians and patient organisations, and is supported by 9 pharmaceutical companies. We are generating gold standard disease level evidence for HTA in Duchenne. Specifically, so far we have undertaken systematic reviews of cost-effectiveness models, utility, burden and cost to understand their fitness for use in DMD. We have been accessing data globally, understanding it, combining it, mapping endpoints, identifying changes meaningful to patients, defining disease states. We have been identifying gaps in evidence and striving to fill them. In development, we have a natural history model based on the largest collection of Duchenne data in the world, which has been developed by the University of Leicester in conjunction with DRISC at the Critical Path Institute. We're working on mortality versus the clinical practice research database. We're developing a new preference-based quality of life measure, specifically for Duchenne, with the University of Sheffield, global leaders in this space. A new, robust cost-effectiveness model is in its final stages, which will be based on the natural history model. A comprehensive burden of illness protocol has begun in the UK and has the capacity to be rolled out across the globe. All our deliverables are due by the end of this year, and it's taken 3 years for a really good reason. It takes a long time to get this sort of data together. It's been done thoroughly, and it hasn't been pulled together in a few months. I think my point being is that I recognise how hard it is to fulfil the needs of a payer assessment in Duchenne, and that the University of Illinois has simply not had enough time or resource and has been given an impossible task to complete to any reasonable standard. I will be critical of the model, but please recognise I do understand how difficult a task it is. I do only have a few minutes. I will focus just on the modelling and give examples rather than repeat the whole critique. Version 1 of the model is hugely oversimplified and actually I feel disrespectful for patients by showing a complete lack of understanding of the disease, keeping only states of ambulation, non-ambulation and death. It has since been updated to include early and late stages, but is still extremely crude. It does reflect other models that have been published, but these have all been heavily criticised, so they're not an appropriate benchmark. I really do appreciate efforts to improve it, but from looking at structure and the comment responses, it has simply moved from being not very good and a poor representation of the disease to being barely adequate. The partition methodology is still inappropriate. It is problematic because intermediate events will be prognostic of later events, and partitioning prevents an exploration of this. The attempts to include mortality are quite crude and use log normal calculations which use simple rightward shifts. This is unrealistic and not the best approximation as claimed in the comment response. I mean, if you take an example, delaying loss of ambulation delays scoliosis. Scoliosis has a direct impact on respiratory function. Respiratory function is highly correlated with mortality, and this has not been explored within the model. The transition probabilities have been taken from a single poster. The author of that poster, Michaela Hill, has explicitly said not to use them in the way they have been incorporated in the model, yet they still remain there. In terms of evidence, it's identified in the technical report that it is sparse. The model relies on limited published sources which do not seem to have been questioned. For example, the utility evidence is from Huey, and that has been proven to be insensitive in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The caregiver quality of life has come from EQ5D, again, completely insensitive to what happens in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So they're probably irrelevant. The cost no one's really spoken about, but they're actually woefully underestimated in the Lanfeld paper. It costs over £200,000 a year for daytime ventilation in the UK. It's going to cost far more than that here, and that's not represented in the model. The stakes are still a little crude. If I put my parents' hat back on as well, all DMD mothers check their son is alive in the morning. That's what you do. But they've also been probably up every hour in the night to see if they were okay or not. The parent's daily assessment is not whether they are walking or not, but it's like noticing thousands of tiny deaths. An extra fall as he can no longer make it from the hall to the kitchen. Can he hold his weight for 3 seconds while you transfer him to the toilet? We don't go to see Grandma today because she lives in a first-floor apartment. Can he lift a glass, a fork, a finger? Is his spine more curved than yesterday? Is that a temperature? Is he getting an infection? He can no longer cough if that's the case. Every day you're terrified that that day might be the last. And I think Mindy's going to talk a little bit more about these sort of smaller changes that are so important. But as I've said, it's thousands of tiny deaths, and they're all important and they're all linked, and the model that we have here is not sensitive enough to explore these links. Any slowing down of this condition is helpful and valuable in costs, health and quality of life, which spiral out of control as this disease relentlessly progresses, and the model just doesn't capture that, I'm afraid. And I do know that the Illinois team have been very generous in their assumptions in the clinical evidence chasm. However, it doesn't really matter if you're making generous assumptions or not if the fundamental structure of the model is incorrect and not robust due to the uncertainty layered on uncertainty multiplied by more uncertainty. I'll touch on the process very quickly. Sorry.
Thank you.
ICER should have a process for dealing with slim evidence base and have the capability and integrity to call a halt rather than do a low-quality assessment with a data-driven model when that data is weak and unreliable. Robust evidence is coming, it would make sense to wait. Now, I'm concerned that you can't even suggest an economically justifiable price for exon-skipping drugs. It implies the model probably isn't quite appropriate. So, in summary, I repeat, I'm not defending pharma clinical trial packages, evidence or pricing decisions. I just believe the model is not robust enough at present to be used to make a decision that impacts hundreds of lives. The process did not allow enough time to do this review justice, doesn't allow for accessing real data and has no peer review of the model. The model's structure is inappropriate, transitions are incorrectly calculated, inputs of utility and costs are insufficient, assumptions are large, multi-layered and not adequately tested. I think this review has been severely constrained by the evidence base, and this disease is too serious and the impact is too high on children and their families in the US to be denied access to therapies that may be delaying those tiny deaths that I spoke of because it hasn't been adequately understood or modelled or the right evidence collected. I think the University of Illinois were given an impossible task.
Thank you very much for your comments. Is there a response from the ICER team?
So I appreciate those comments, and I do think that there is a lot of room to have better evidence for these treatments. Again, I felt we did the best we could with the available evidence, and I think that we have a quantitatively accurate estimate for the lower bound of the incremental cost effectiveness of this disease. There are important potential impacts that a treatment could have without changing ambulation or time till death. Those kinds of possible utility gains that may be there are going to be smaller than the utility gains that we have available to us from moving from non-ambulation to ambulation. The utility scores that we use in the available health states have face validity. They're very, very low in the non-ambulatory states. They're substantially low even in the ambulatory states. And I think that they reflect a bounded estimate of potential treatment gains from eliminating or improving this disease. So I commend the ongoing efforts to better understand this disease, better nuance it. I hope that there are treatments that come that are extremely impactful, and I feel for these patients. At the current prices of these treatments, and given the available measures we have and the constructs to do it, I stand by what we did. It's robust to a lot of assumption changes, and I think it is a lower bound for deflazacort. For eteplirsen, at $1 million a year, there just isn't a treatment effect that's going to be cost effective. You can measure it any old way you want to. So,
Thank you. We'll now move on to Annie Kennedy.
Hi, good morning. I'm Annie Kennedy with Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. PPMD supports certified Duchenne care centers, newborn screening programs, genetic testing program, a global patient registry, and among other things, a pre-competitive consortia of all of our industry partners to conduct these efforts. We do receive funding from more than 40 of the industry partners in the Duchenne space. PPMD has taken advantage of every opportunity to engage, inform, and provide input in this current review. And today we'd like to underscore a few of the key items that we believe are foundational in Duchenne and the development of this model. While we're gratified that the presentation of the evidence today included mention of this following priority, we remain concerned that this report fails to strongly reflect that within the Duchenne community, slowing or halting of disease progression through treatment intervention is significant. The impact of such on the lives of both parents and caregivers should be reflected in the modeling. Number two, as we've expressed starting in November of 2015 and the subsequent engagements as members of the working group of the ICER Orphan Drug Assessment and Pricing Summit, and now again as the Duchenne product-specific assessment has been conducted, we have a significant concern about the ICER assessment timing for products approved via the accelerated approval pathway. The FDA accelerated approval program was established to allow for products that meet regulatory rigor based on efficacy of a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to have clinical benefit for select patient communities in which there is a significant unmet need. By definition, limited clinical data for products approved for this accelerated approval will exist at the time of approval and in early stages of the phase 4 environment. In these circumstances, this lack of clinical data is not necessarily a reflection of the robustness of the therapy, but rather the regulatory review pathway agreed upon by the product developer and the Food and Drug Administration. While ICER has responded to public input around these concerns by adding language to the current report reflecting the difficulties in generating evidence around treatments for ultra-rare diseases, we strongly urge ICER to reevaluate the time point in which such assessments are conducted. From the perspective of the patient community, there is little value in conducting an assessment at the time point in which it is known in advance that insufficient evidence will be available to conduct meta-analyses. Further, to fundamentally damage the market in early stage is to potentially deny life-changing benefit to patients who are deserving and have no other therapeutic options. Our third point concerns the timing of prior authorizations. As described here today and in the report, living with Duchenne is a difficult enough journey without additional access hurdles and burdens. Individuals with Duchenne should not have to go through the process of prior authorization every 6 or 12 months. This is a waste of resources and delays care. These gaps or delays in care undermine the effectiveness and therefore the value of these treatments. In the healthcare system, if the healthcare system has decided that a person with Duchenne is eligible for a product, that eligibility is unlikely to change in 6 or 12 months. In circumstances where eligibility or dosing changes are needed, a qualified provider will make those recommendations with the patient and his or her family. We urge ICER to consider including language in the final report that dissuades this practice of requiring frequent prior authorizations. Among the most critical considerations that must be taken into account is the yet to be fully known of all these interventions that must be weighted against the certainty of doing nothing. Maintaining strength and function, slowing disease progression, reducing chance of infection, and optimizing potential outcomes for potential future interventions are all of extreme value to patients and providers within the Duchenne community. Thanks to a decade of advocacy, funding, and innovation, our Duchenne healthcare landscape is rapidly changing. As new therapies emerge into the marketplace, patients, providers, and payers are faced with challenges as to how to discern which therapies are most appropriate for which patients in which combinations at which time. We are committed to collaborating on the development of evidence and resources to facilitate this decision-making and recognize that ICER's construct is an attempt to define value of specific interventions. That said, we're concerned that ICER's current framework and construct does not yet consider patient experience and input meaningfully into the underlying equation. We feel strongly that patients and providers must continue to have access to all therapies approved for the treatment of Duchenne, and that valuation should be seen as an additional resource to empower individual patient-provider decision-making. Valuation should not be utilized as a singular tool for policymakers to limit access. Such actions could have catastrophic ramifications for people with Duchenne. Therapies which provide any incremental benefit should be prioritized and likely will be the foundation for later combination therapies. We thank ICER for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you for your comment. Would you like to respond, Steve?
Just briefly. Thank you, Annie, and thank you also for the collaboration and the input that your group and others have provided. Just a comment about the timing, because we feel the same tension about obviously realizing that we're going to have limited evidence when we come into review, even when it's not accelerated approval. We always know that there will be more learned, and it's a one point in time. As you know, the challenge is that the drug is on the market and the company gets to name its price. And that creates, I mean, if the company said, we're going to provide it at the marginal cost of production until we have better evidence, I'm not sure we would have a meeting. We would wait and see what we learned and come back. And we probably will come back when there is further evidence. But in the short term, people who don't have the benefit of talking to you directly will be sitting in a dark room somewhere making a decision about coverage and trying to negotiate pricing. So those decisions, and clinicians and others, patients and families, are making decisions every single day. So in a sense, that's why we have to push this process to a point at which the decisions are being made, because they're so consequential. Even though later evidence will come, a lot of this gets set in stone for good or ill. So I hope that we can address some of the issues around prior authorization and other things, certainly in the policy roundtable. But I just wanted to acknowledge the tension around the type of evidence. Fortunately, it's extremely rare that we ourselves rate a drug at launch with accelerated approval as having insufficient evidence of efficacy versus placebo. I'm not sure, I should look back, I'm not sure we have ever said that before. So this is an unusual circumstance. But we still acknowledge that the evidence base is limited, and that can create a perception that we're rushing to judgment.
Thank you very much for your comment. We'll move to Mindy.
So I just want to start out by articulating the amount of discomfort that I feel in this position, which I feel is kind of being put in the middle between two parties. And I don't want to be seen as making comments that are in defense of a pricing structure that, we obviously share some frustration with. But I do want to make sure that I communicate the extent to which I feel this evidence is insufficient to make this evaluation, because the consequences of limited access at this point is that we will never get definitive evidence. The context of this drug's development and the nature of the approval were such that there were not boys available to gather this definitive evidence because they had already been dosed by a competitor. And that is why the data is limited. And then in addition to that, I just want to comment specifically on the outcome measures being used. And I want people to understand the degree of insufficiency of the outcome measures in their ability to measure changes in patients' disease trajectory. So I have really two main concerns. And when you're speaking about the 6-minute walk specifically, my concerns are only escalated above the other outcome measures that are available. The outcome measures that were used to evaluate these treatments do not measure what is at the heart of this disease and what is important to patients. This disease makes it difficult to move. And what patients want to do is be able to move their bodies around so that they can preserve the degree of independence. All of these outcome measures are based on the premise that the speed to do something is reflective of the ease for a patient's ability to do something. And to me, that's a huge extrapolation that does not get at the heart of this disease. It's why I'm doing what I'm doing, which is trying to quantify ease of movements. So we're looking at compensatory movement patterns that patients adopt in a subconscious way to preserve their independence. So when they come up against the inability to accomplish a task, then they adopt an additional compensation to be able to preserve that degree of independence. And so we're quantifying how those compensatory movement patterns change over time. So that's my main concern about these outcome measures. They are all based on timed performance, which, as my son will say, nobody cares about speed walking. Never wanted to speed walk, don't have any desire to do so, and it has nothing to do with my quality of life. Secondly, disease benefit in heterogeneous rare disease in the short term is patient-specific. If you take one outcome measure and you apply it to a large heterogeneous population, you're going to have to watch that outcome measure for an extended period of time before you learn anything definitive. And so I have a couple of videos that I want to show because I want to illustrate the extent to which that affects our interpretation of disease progression in Duchenne. So I have several videos. One is a patient who was withdrawn from a treatment in a clinical trial after an adverse event in that trial. So we watched these patients come off drug, and we watched their movement patterns and how they changed. So the first two videos are this patient at time point 1 and time point 3, 6 months apart, right after drug withdrawal and 6 months later. And this is, I think, reflective of what would be considered a more standard clinical assessment of getting off the floor from a cross-legged position. So I'd just like to play these two videos, and then I want to comment on them. So if you take a look at this child and you time it out, he times out very similarly from time point 1 to time point 2. He looks very similar from time point 1 to time point 2. So if you take a look at this patient and you think this is a standard clinical assessment, I want to understand the disease trajectory of this patient as he's withdrawn from treatment, you would think stable. Everybody would come away with the impression this child is stable. So what we had the parents do is the parents were allowed to select an activity that they felt was on the bleeding edge of that child's function so that they could really understand what was going on with that patient. Parents knew that by asking the child to cross his arms while he was standing up from a cross-legged position, that would stress his function to the point that they would know what was actually going on with this patient over the same time period. So this is a series of 3 videos. Time point 1, he's getting off the floor from a cross-legged position, can accomplish that task. Time point 2, which is an interim time point between 3 months, you can see how much more difficult it is for him to raise that second leg. And by time point 3, child can't accomplish the task at all. So if you're evaluating this child based on standardized clinical endpoints, your conclusion is that this child is stable over this time period. But when you drill down into patient-specific function, that's absolutely not what's going on. And that highlights the challenge of outcome measure selection in Duchenne. You are running the risk of selecting an outcome measure that is not sensitive to change for a particular patient because it's not challenging enough, or you're running the risk of selecting an outcome measure that is beyond the point of recoverability for that individual patient. So the last set of videos, this is my son when he started on eteplirsen. The last series of videos on this. But at the end of that, Kat? This is him at baseline. Can you pause it 1 second? Can you pause for 1 second? He had lost the ability to pull himself into our minivan independently about 5 months prior to starting on treatment. I knew that it was something that he had recently lost the ability to do or had struggled with, so I put it on video for the next 7 months. So this is him 5 months on treatment. This is him 7 months on treatment. What is his name? What is his name? My son's name, Aiden. And this is about 1.5 years on treatment. So the idea that an 11-year-old who had lost function would recover that function and be able to perform that activity for an extended period beyond that, I think is not indicative of what would typically happen in a placebo effect. And it just highlights my concern with the fact, and I have the same concern in the fact that we are using these outcome measures in clinical trials and not gathering definitive evidence. I have the same concern about the conduct of clinical trials as I do with this evaluation, which is that if we are looking at something over the short term, it has to be patient-specific.
Thank you very much for that comment and for the informative videos. Does the ICER team have any comments?
I actually had a question not on the video, but on the comment about the ability to do trials. There are countries that haven't yet approved the exon skipping therapies. Is there a reason that we couldn't do randomized trials in those countries and find patients there? I'm asking this perfectly seriously.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can comment on that. So at the time that this 12-patient study was conducted, there was a competitor drug targeting the same exons as this one, so targeting patients amenable to exon 51. That company conducted a large-scale worldwide phase 3, as well as a US phase 2. So there, I feel confident in saying there were no patients left who were naive to drug at the time. And I will say one reason why I have an infinite amount of respect for those at FDA who are willing to acknowledge the context around Bixandi's development, understood that there is a limit to what we can do to one individual child. So, I mean, I'm in Seattle. I'm halfway between Vancouver, which was a phase 3 site, and Portland, which was a phase 2 site. And to say to one child, one 8-year-old boy, I understand that you have been cut open 3 times and been through 6 to 12 months of placebo already, but we're going to go ahead and do it to you again. This time, you know, you'll have 2 additional muscle biopsies. You'll have another surgery to have a port inserted. And that's an ethical thing to do. You can't consider an ethical evaluation of a study in a vacuum. And I think FDA's willingness to consider, you know, what this population of boys had been through was really pivotal in the decision-making process. And I don't think that's been publicly acknowledged. There is a limit to what can be done to one little boy in this search for definitive evidence. And that context was, and I will say the phase 2 study in the United States that took place did not reach full enrollment for this competitor drug. They actually had to relax inclusion criteria just to get to the numbers that they did, which were short of full enrollment. That's just within the United States. Then there were 180 patients participating in the worldwide phase 3. There were no patients left.
Thank you very much. I believe our 4th commenter has not arrived. Ms. McSherry? Okay. Then at this point, oh, please. That's all right.
There's a chair.
Yeah.
Sorry. You can bring another chair.
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you. And I really respect the comments that I've heard since I've come in so far. I have conflicts of interest. I am the founder of Jet Foundation. Jet Foundation was started in 2001 when my son Jet was diagnosed with Duchenne. We do receive grants from Sarepta and PTC, as well as about 38 other organizations worldwide. I also co-founded Casimir with Mindy, and we are currently under contract with Sarepta to facilitate 2 observational video capture studies. And I think that Mindy very eloquently described the reason why we are pursuing video capture, because the movements that we noticed during our studies were so nuanced that they couldn't be captured necessarily in the clinic. I also want to talk a little bit about my son's experience. So Jet was started on drug in November of 2014. And at that time, the CEO of the company actually said to me, he's the oldest, sickest boy that we have starting this safety study. Me being a nurse, I think he was concerned that I would be biased and I would be watching my son too carefully. So I decided to not really watch my son at all. I knew that the dystrophin evidence wasn't produced in the data until 6 months, 24 weeks. So in November, when he got his first dose, I kind of just said to myself, we're going to cause a blind eye to this, and I'll take a look at him in April. I was really surprised when his roommate came home after winter break, and his roommate was a big football guy, didn't know anything about Duchenne, and didn't know why I was taking Jet to these infusions every week in Boston, except that he got Fridays off, which was great. And he came in after Christmas break, and he opened the refrigerator door, and he grabbed out a bottle of water. And I said, Mario, geez, you're in a great mood. He said, of course I'm in a good mood. He said, I slept better. I'm sleeping better. And I said, well, what do you mean you're sleeping better? Why are you sleeping better? And he said, I'm sleeping better because Jet stopped snoring. And as a nurse and as a mother, obviously, I said, that's unbelievable. What do you mean he stopped snoring? He's like, yeah, I came back from Christmas break and I'm getting a good night's sleep every night now. So at 2 o'clock that morning, I got up, I went down and I laid on my son's hardwood floor and I listened. And sure enough, the snore that his other 4 siblings would say, Mom, we can't sleep with him in the room, had gone down to a very low rumble. And his breathing was steady. And for the first time, I didn't hear any apnea at all. As I noticed the next morning, he was happier. He was more fulfilled. He wasn't yawning in my face when I went to pick him up and transfer him. He was doing better in school. He was communicating more. The next thing that I noticed was about a week later. Jet was losing the ability to sit on the bed with only one person before the transfer would happen. You see, he's fully immobile. He can't stand on his own. So as I put my arm on his shoulder, realizing in my head, geez, I'm going to have to change my entire life soon because I need 2 people here to get him out of bed. I had one hand on his shoulder and one hand on his power chair, and I took my hand off his shoulder and he sat, and he didn't fall over. I said, you're sitting on the side of the bed. He goes, I know, I always do. I'm like, actually, you don't. And so in that moment, everything in my family's life then changed because I didn't have to hire a second person. My husband didn't have to stay home from work. My other son could go to college because it only took one person to transfer Jet into the power chair that day. And that still stays true till today. The next thing that happened, which you've probably heard before, is I do have 5 children, and the 4th one is always getting into mischief. He came down one Sunday morning and he said, Mom, don't be upset. I said, don't be upset about what? What did you do? He said, last night, now Jet is now a freshman in college. Last night, Jet was downstairs in the basement with his friends. He had a couple of beers. I said, I could tell because when he came upstairs, he was like this, going down the hallway with his power chair. Yes, I let it happen. He said that wasn't the problem. The problem was Jet was able to reach over, get the beer, and open it himself. A rite of passage for a young man as a freshman in college. And I'm sure everybody here can appreciate their first beer in college, right? So what we don't take into consideration when we look at these outcome measures is the quality of life, the confidence, the independence that Jet had in those moments and continues to have to this day. That's what's missing in the outcome measures. And when we look at a drug, why do we look at one single outcome measure? Why are we not looking at everything that happens to those young people or to those individuals taking that drug? And why do we simply just let a company pick one endpoint when we've never seen functional benefit and hope, leave it all to chance, our kids' lives to chance, when we haven't even asked what meaningful benefit looks like to them? So we're not talking about, like we do with big other drugs, this isn't a drug that treats asthma, and we can't take the same system that we use to alleviate the symptom of wheezing and apply that to something like Duchenne. What we need to do is find those nuanced outcome measures. We need to listen to the patients and what's happening to them and understand what the quality of life benefits are. These aren't symptoms that we're trying to take away from our kids. We're trying to save our kids' lives. Thank you. One more thing. I just want to add, sorry. Jet Foundation has done 2 studies, and ICER they're available for ICER to review. One study was a retrospective study on eteplirsen that had about 14 patients in it, and that was given to FDA for review. The second study was more of a quality of life qualitative interview study that consisted of 60 patients. Of all the patients that we studied, both in the first one and the second one, not a single patient or caregiver, despite the fact that they were given 3 chances to define what meaningful benefit would look like to them, which adds up to over 180 responses. Not a single person or a patient named the speed of movement. not a single one.
Thank you very much for those great comments. At this point, we'll conclude public comments.